Ted Hamptree stood on the baseball field, leaning on a worn bat. The April sun was golden in his gray hair, which was poking out from under his Oak Ridge Raiders cap. Over 45 years of coaching, his figure had become an integral part of the landscape. Tall, trim, with a military bearing that neither years nor arthritis had erased, the boys on the field were practicing their pitches, and the sound of the ball hitting the bat echoed in my chest with a familiar joy. The town of Oak Ridge lived for sports. Every spring, the streets were empty. Everyone flocked to the school stadium. The baseball field was a shrine, and Ted Hamptree, its high priest, 12 state titles, spoke for themselves. The local newspaper called him a legend maker. He produced 5 major league professional players. A picture of one of them still hangs in his office. Johnny Myers, pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, once as awkward a teenager as those boys on the field. On this day, he watched practice with special attention. Something told him this spring would be special, perhaps the last of his career. 70 years old is a serious age, even for a legend. Ted could feel it in his aching joints, in the way it was getting harder and harder to show the right stance for a hit, in the way his memory sometimes failed him, confusing the names of new players. The small town lived its own measured rhythm. In the morning, Mrs. O'Brien's bakery filled the main street with the aroma of fresh-baked goods. Old Peterson swept the sidewalk in front of his sporting goods store, where the window displayed the very bat with which Ted had hit the deciding ball in the state finals in 1972nd year. Everyone here knew each other, and everyone knew Ted Hamptree. Dwight Prescott, his assistant, was collecting balls after practice, young, energetic, but still inexperienced. Too soft for a coach, Ted often thought as he watched him work with the team. The 35-year-old Dwight was good with statistics and tactics, but he lacked the toughness that was essential to raising a true athlete. Today, Dwight was particularly distracted, his eyes darting back and forth to the other end of the field where the cheerleaders were practicing. Ted followed his gaze. The cheerleaders were rehearsing a new program. A tall girl with red hair gathered into a tight ponytail stood out among them. Mabel Sterling. He knew her name. It was hard not to know the cheerleading captain who had led the team to victory at regionals. There was a special grace about her that was uncommon for her age. She moved as if music was playing inside her. In the evening, when the stadium was empty and only the setting sun colored the stands orange, there was a knock on his office door. Mabel stood on the threshold, rubbing the edge of her sports jacket. In the dusk, her red hair seemed like a dark flame. "Mr. Hamptree, sorry to bother you. I wanted to check on next week's training schedule. We're planning a new program." Her voice was low, husky. Ted caught himself thinking that the voice didn't match her young face. There was something about her, an unchildlike seriousness in her gaze, a restraint in her movements. He explained the schedule, she thanked him, and left. Dwight's quick footsteps were heard in the hallway. He often stayed late, ostensibly working on game strategy. Ted knew the real reason for these delays. The young coach clearly had a thing for the captain of the cheerleaders, though he tried to hide it. Turning off the lights in his office, he looked at the pictures on the wall for the umpteenth time. Teams from different years, cups, awards, smiling faces. Some of these boys had already become fathers themselves and brought their children to practice. 45 springs had passed like one, but this one seemed different for some reason. New, the last. Oak Ridge fell asleep, sheltered by the soft twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a baseball clattered against a bat as one of his boys honed his swing for the upcoming season. The evening light was coming on in the windows of the houses, the street lights were turning on Main Street, and the last customers were finishing their coffee at Mabel's mother, Wendy Sterling's diner. The town lived its usual life, unaware that this spring would change everything. Ted walked slowly to his car, feeling the cool spring wind get under his jacket. Clouds were gathering in the east. Rain was promised tomorrow. He figured he'd have to move his workout to the indoor gym if the weather turned bad. For some reason, that thought gave him a strange uneasiness, like a premonition of something imminent. The Oak Ridge City Library was housed in an old Victorian mansion with stained glass windows. Ted Hamptree usually came here on Thursdays after practice, a habit developed over decades. Between the rows of shabby tomes, soaked with the odor of time, He felt at ease. That night he'd been looking for Ty Cobb's biography. He wanted to refresh his memory for tomorrow's lecture on the great players of the past. A familiar red lock of hair flashed among the bookshelves. Mabel Sterling was sitting at the far table, leaning over a shabby volume by Sylvia Plath. She didn't notice him right away. She looked up as he was about to pass, and something like embarrassment flashed in her gaze, as if he had caught her in something intimate. "Interesting choice, Miss Sterling." His voice sounded unexpectedly soft. She smiled, closing the book. "Everyone thinks cheerleaders only read glossy magazines." There was a slight bitterness in her voice. "And I love poetry, especially honest, unadorned poetry." They talked. It turned out that the girl, who shone on the field in a short dress with pom-poms, knew Lady Lazarus by heart and dreamed of studying literature in college. Her eyes lit up when she talked about books, and Ted caught himself thinking that he couldn't look away. At home, Mabel's mother, Wendy Sterling, a waitress at the local diner, Joe's, was waiting for her. A tired woman of 42, she greeted her daughter with the usual question about her training. Mabel answered something vaguely, hurrying off to her room. She'd been doing that a lot lately, shutting herself away, withdrawing into herself. Wendy sighed, looking at the picture on the wall of her and little Mabel on the beach, before her husband left her for the young secretary at the insurance company. 12 years had passed since then, but the loneliness still felt like a fresh wound. At school, Dwight Prescott kept glancing at the captain of the cheerleading squad. He tried to appear casual, passing by during practice, making up excuses to talk. But his interest was becoming more and more obvious, causing whispers among the students. Mabel didn't seem to notice. Her thoughts were far away, there, among the bookshelves, where the gray-haired coach was talking to her about literature and life. She caught herself looking for a meeting with him, lingering after training, passing by his office. Something was happening between them, unnamed, wrong, but inescapable like a spring downpour. They both sensed it, trying to ignore it. But in a small town where everyone knows each other, it's hard to hide even a thought. One evening, Ted found Sylvia Plath's tome on his desk. Between the pages was a bookmark with a handwritten note. "Thank you for talking about poetry." He stared at the neat handwriting for a long time, then slowly put the book away in his desk drawer. That evening he thought for the first time that it might be time to retire. But the thought of it brought a sudden pain, as if he were betraying something important, or someone. Meanwhile, in the locker room, Dwight Prescott watched Mabel walk by, his gaze growing darker and darker. He noticed things others didn't, the way her face changed when her old coach appeared, the way she watched him furtively during games. Spring was gaining strength in Oak Ridge. The apple trees were blooming in the city park, where Mabel often walked alone, thinking about something of her own, or maybe about someone. The air smelled of change, and the odor was sweet and bitter at the same time. It all started with a note left in a book. "In the old gazebo of the city park, after 6. Ted stared at those words for a long time, written in familiar handwriting. He knew he should throw the note away, forget about it. Instead, he walked down the park alley in the evening, his hands trembling treacherously. The gazebo was buried in blooming lilacs. Mabel was waiting for him, sitting on an old bench. Her hair looked copper in the sunset sunlight. They talked about nothing about training, about the weather, about books. But they both realized that it was just a way to fill the silence, to hide the main thing that drew them to each other. From that evening on, they began to meet regularly. The gazebo became their secret place. Ted talked about the Vietnam War, about his youth, about a time when baseball was very different. Mabel listened, holding her breath. She had never met a man who had such a deep understanding of life. Meanwhile, Dwight Prescott was staying late at school more and more often. He watched Mabel from afar, gathering every detail of her life like an obsessive. He wrote down in his notebook the times she came and went, noted what clothes she wore, who she talked to. His interest grew into a morbid mania. Wendy Sterling noticed the change in her daughter. Mabel seemed to glow from within, often humming something while doing laundry or helping in the kitchen. But there were other changes as well. She became secretive, often staying late after school, excusing herself with extra workouts. "Are you in love?" Wendy asked one day at dinner. Mabel flinched, dropping her fork. No, Mom, what a silly thing to say. But the blush on her cheeks gave her away. Their secret meetings grew longer and longer. They talked about everything in the world: poetry, dreams, disappointments. Sometimes they were just silent, watching the sunset. At such moments, Ted felt surprisingly young, as if the years were falling off his shoulders like autumn leaves. One day, their hands accidentally touched. A simple touch, but it sent an electric shock through both of them. They recoiled from each other, frightened by the power of that moment. The denouement almost came during an important match of the season. Mabel, as captain of the cheerleading squad, had to perform before the game. Ted was watching her from the dugout, oblivious to the team. Dwight noticed that look. He saw the old coach's face change as Mabel began her dance. At halftime, Dwight walked up to Tad. "Pretty girl, isn't she?" His voice oozed venom. Tad didn't answer, pretending to study the game notes, but his hands trembled, giving away his excitement. After the match, Mabel was waiting for him in his office. "He knows," she whispered. "Dwight is watching me. I can feel his eyes on me all the time." Ted reassured her, telling her it was all make-believe, but deep down he knew she was right. That evening, Wendy found a movie ticket in her daughter's pocket with "Meet me there" written on the back. The handwriting was clearly male, old-fashioned. She stared at the note for a long time, but did not dare to ask her daughter directly. Their secret was getting heavier and heavier. Every glance, every casual gesture could give them away. But they couldn't stop now. Something greater than themselves ruled their destinies. One evening, as they sat in their arbor, Mabel cried suddenly. "I can't go on like this," she whispered. Tad took her hand gently. It was the first time in all these weeks that he had allowed himself that gesture. And in the darkness of the school hallway, Dwight Prescott clenched his fists, staring at Mabel's picture in the school yearbook. His obsession grew every day, turning into something dark and dangerous. Spring was slowly turning into summer. The air was becoming thick and heavy like their secret. They didn't know that things were about to change, that their story was approaching a denouement neither of them could have foreseen. June was sweltering. Training was over, but Mabel and Ted continued to meet in the old gazebo. Their relationship had changed. They sat closer together. Their hands touched more often, and the silence became more intimate, filled with unspoken words. One evening, Ted dared to touch her hair. A simple gesture, but it changed everything. Mabel closed her eyes, submitting to his touch. In that moment, both realized they had crossed some invisible line. "I'm scared," she admitted later. "I don't understand what's going on. You're so much older than my father, but next to you I feel alive." Her voice shook. Ted was silent, staring at the sunset. He knew he had to stop this madness, but he couldn't find the strength. At home, Mabel locked herself in her room more and more often. She stopped eating, hardly slept at all. Wendy would find crumpled pieces of paper with unfinished letters. "I can't go on like this. It's not right. But I can't do it without..." The scraps of phrases startled her. One evening, Dwight stayed at school longer than usual. He was about to leave when he noticed a familiar figure gliding toward the park. Mabel. He followed her, keeping in the shade of the trees. What he saw in the old gazebo made him freeze. Ted and Mabel sat side by side, their silhouettes merged in the semi-darkness. The old coach was holding her hand, and they were talking quietly. Dwight watched as if mesmerized. His fists clenched and unclenched, his nails dug into his palms until they bled. The next day, Ted found an anonymous note on his desk. "I know everything." The handwriting was deliberately altered, but he knew at once who it was from. All day he'd felt Dwight's heavy gaze on him. Mabel noticed the change, too. Dwight started showing up everywhere she went. At the store, at the library, outside her house. He was no longer trying to hide his obsession. "Maybe we should stop seeing each other," Mabel said one night. Her voice sounded muffled. "This whole thing, it's wrong. People are starting to notice." Ted nodded, but they both knew it was a lie. They didn't care what people thought. That night, Tad didn't sleep. He thought about his life, his career, his reputation. Everything he'd accomplished in 70 years could come crashing down in an instant. But the worst of it was the thought that he had really fallen in love with a girl who was old enough to be his granddaughter. Mabel, too, was uneasy. She wandered about the room, looking through old photographs. In one of them, she was with her father, the last picture before he left the family. "All men leave someday," her mother had often said. Now those words sounded like a prophecy, and Dwight watched them both. His obsession had grown into something more, a thirst for revenge. He saw their secret meetings, saw their touch, saw the way they looked at each other, and something inside him was breaking with each passing day. The denouement was approaching inexorably. Ted felt it with every fiber of his being. One morning, looking at himself in the mirror, he made a decision. This had to end, for her sake, for both of their sakes. He wrote a short note, "Tonight, we need to talk." And for the first time since they'd met, signed his name. It was the end of a secret, the beginning of something new, or the end of everything. The air smelled like a thunderstorm. Heavy clouds were gathering over Oak Ridge, portending a storm. No one knew this night would change their lives forever. "You're right, I've made a serious error in plotting a detective story. Let's rewrite this chapter, keeping the suspense and not revealing the killer. It will make the story more intriguing to the reader." Their last meeting was to be at the gym, where it all began. Mabel arrived before the appointed time. She sat on a bench in the empty locker room, going over the events of the past few months in her mind. Every touch, every look, every word, it all seemed like a dream now. Outside the window, a thunderstorm was coming. Mabel shuddered at the unexpected sound. She did not turn on the light. It was easier to think in the dark. Footsteps sounded somewhere in the hallway. Her heart beat faster. She'd been expecting Tad, but those footsteps were different. Alien. Ted was only 15 minutes late for the meeting. The storm had gotten worse, and he'd had to stop home to get an umbrella. When he entered the gym, the first thing he noticed was the unusual silence. Even the rain seemed to have subsided. He found Mabel's body in the locker room. She was lying by the bench, her red hair strewn across the floor like copper threads. Nearby lay a bloody bat, the legendary one from Peterson's storefront. Ted sank to his knees, unable to believe his eyes. His hands trembled as he tried to feel for a pulse. He made the call to the police mechanically, as if in a dream. The voice in the receiver seemed distant and unreal. 20 minutes later, the gym filled with uniformed men. The flashing lights of police cars painted the walls blue and red. Detective Rufus Caldwell was the last to arrive, a tall man in his 50s with attentive gray eyes. He surveyed the crime scene in silence, making notes in his notebook. His gaze lingered on the bat, then on the scattered belongings. It looked like there had been a struggle. "Mr. Hamtree, tell me everything from the beginning." His voice was calm, professional, but Tad remained silent. What could he tell? About the secret meetings in the gazebo? About the furtive touches? About how much he loved her despite the age difference? Wendy Sterling arrived an hour later. Her scream, full of pain and despair, broke the silence of the night. She fell to her knees beside her daughter's body, but the police dragged her away. They needed to keep the crime scene intact. "Where were you between 8 and 9 p.m.? The detective asked Tad. The man looked up. "Stopped by the house to get an umbrella. I was supposed to meet her here at 8:30. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Meet? Why?" But Tad was silent again. The same thought kept running through his mind. If he hadn't gone to get that damn umbrella, if he'd gotten here on time. By morning, the rain had stopped. The techs had collected all the evidence. The body had been taken away. The gym was empty. Only the yellow police tape on the locker room door was a reminder of what had happened. Caldwell stood on the school porch, smoking a cigarette. Something didn't add up in this picture. Why the bat from the store? Who knew about the meeting? And most importantly, why did the school cheerleader have a date with the elderly coach? Ted walked home. His car was left in the school parking lot. The police wanted to look at it later. The rising sun painted the streets of Oak Ridge pink, but to him, the world had lost all color. In his pocket was the note he was going to give to Mabel, a note saying they should stop seeing each other. It meant nothing now. Detective Rufus Caldwell didn't like small towns. One thing he'd learned in 30 years on the job was that the smaller the town, the more secrets it held. Oak Ridge had plenty of them. They hid behind lace curtains, behind freshly painted fences, behind the friendly smiles of the locals. The morning after the murder was unnaturally bright. Caldwell walked down the main street, noting how conversations quieted as he approached. The town seemed to freeze like a frightened animal. In the window of Joe's cafe hung a picture of Mabel, a smiling girl in a cheerleader's uniform. Someone had already placed flowers under the window. The first item on his list was Peterson's sporting goods store. The ringing of the bell over the door seemed inappropriately cheerful. Old Peterson stood behind the counter, hunched over the broken display case. The shards of glass had already been removed, but the empty space where the historic bat used to be kept gaped like an open wound. Between 7 and 8 p.m., Peterson said, nervously wiping his glasses. I was just closing up the store. Went out for 5 minutes. Forgot the register in the back room. Came back. The window was smashed. No bat. He shook his head. 40 years. No one's made an attempt on that bat. And here, Caldwell examined the display case. A professional strike with a rock, right in the corner where the glass was most vulnerable. Doesn't look like impulsive vandalism. Someone knew what they were doing. He was met with an oppressive silence at the school. Classes had been canceled, but the teachers' lounge was full. Teachers gathered in groups, whispering. When the detective appeared, the chatter died down. Ted Hamtree's office was like a museum of sports glory. Photos of teams from different years, cups, pennants. The coach himself sat at his desk, gaunt and aged. On the wall behind him hung the very same photograph. The winning game of the 72nd year, young Ted with the bat that had now become the murder weapon. Tell me about last night. Caldwell pulled out a notebook. From the beginning. Ted spoke slowly, as if each word hurt. He told about the arrangement to meet Mabel at the gym, about how he'd stayed home late because of the rain, about how he'd found her. Why did you make the appointment? We needed to talk. About what? Ted was silent, staring out the window at the empty baseball field. Dwight Prescott was interviewed next. The assistant coach looked exhausted, circles darkening under his eyes. His small office next to the locker room seemed uncomfortable. Bare walls, minimal furniture. I was at home, he said quickly, tapping his fingers nervously on the desk. Watched a replay of the Yankees game. No one can confirm it. I live alone. How long have you been working with Mr. Hamtree? 3 years. He's a great coach. And Mabel Sterling, what can you say about her? Dwight's fingers froze. Talented girl. Everyone loved her. Have you noticed anything unusual in her behavior lately? She's been staying after practice a lot. Talked to Ted, Mr. Hamtree. Something in his tone made Caldwell wary. Jealousy? Resentment? Wendy Sterling received the detective in the apartment above the diner. The small living room was littered with pictures of her daughter. Mabel the baby, Mabel on the first day of school, Mabel with her cheerleader pom-poms. She's changed this spring. Wendy rubbed the frames of the photos absent-mindedly. Became kind of aloof. I used to find poems in her room. Thought, first love, she sobbed. If only I'd known. By evening, the first forensic results were on Caldwell's desk. Traces of a struggle in the locker room. Blood spatter on the wall. Victim tried to defend herself. Shoe prints on the floor. Men's size, standard sneakers. No sign of rain. The killer entered the building before the storm hit. The city was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. All they could talk about at Joe's cafe was the murder. Some recalled seeing Mabel with a man in the city park. Others whispered about Dwight Prescott's strange behavior. Still others shook their heads as they discussed Ted Hamtree's reputation. Caldwell sat in his makeshift office at the police station, crime scene photos spread out before him. Something wasn't adding up in this mosaic. The murder seemed both spontaneous and carefully planned. The theft of the bat, the time chosen, the place. Caldwell rose, throwing on his cloak. Outside the window, the clouds were gathering again. Oak Ridge was preparing for another storm, not realizing that the major thunder and lightning were yet to come. By the end of the third day of the investigation, Rufus Caldwell felt the story beginning to take shape. The experts found a cache in the school locker room. Behind a rickety panel in the far corner inside lay an album of Mabel's photographs. Dozens of pictures taken surreptitiously. Mabel at practice, Mabel in the library, Mabel in the city park. Some of them were of her with Ted Hamtree. Caldwell arranged the photos on the table in chronological order. The earliest ones were taken in early spring. The last one was the day before the murder. The photographer's handwriting was that of a professional. Precise angles, precise focus. A new interrogation of Wendy Sterling revealed unexpected details. It turned out that 12 years ago, when her husband left her for another woman, it was Ted Hamtree who had helped her find a job at the diner and get Mabel into a good school. "He always took care of us," Wendy said, nervously rubbing her napkin. "Came to all the important events in Mabel's life. Was like a father to her." She was quiet for a moment. "At least that's what I thought." Ted Hamtree's story, too, was more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Caldwell picked up old newspapers. In 1972, the young coach had suffered a personal tragedy. His fiancée had been killed in a car accident a week before the wedding. After that, he fully devoted himself to work. Did not marry, had no children. The school team became his only family. Dwight Prescott had his own secrets. Before moving to Oak Ridge, he worked as a school photographer in Nashville. He left after some kind of scandal. The details were carefully hushed up. Caldwell sent a request to the Nashville Police Archives. By evening, the answer came back. 3 years ago, there were charges against Prescott for inappropriate behavior with a high school girl. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but he lost his job. Ted Hamtree, his former high school coach, offered him an assistant position at Oak Ridge. Caldwell questioned Ted again. This time, the conversation was about his relationship with Mabel. "I fell in love with her." The old coach's voice trembled. "I know it's wrong. I know I should have stayed away, but she was so alive. Reminded me of Elizabeth." "Your fiancée?" "Yes, same fire in her eyes, the same passion for life." "Is that why you made the appointment at the gym?" "I wanted to end it all, to say I was leaving. I tendered my resignation a week ago." The school archives did indeed turn up a resignation letter dated last Wednesday. A new search of Dwight's office yielded unexpected results. The double bottom of a desk drawer revealed an envelope of negatives. The developed images captured Ted and Mabel meeting in a city park. They were holding hands. The last shot was almost a kiss. At the same time, forensics was examining the murder weapon. Microscopic particles of paint were found on the bat, the same paint that was used to paint the window of Peterson's store. Someone touched it when they stole it. Caldwell went back to the witness statements. Mrs. Parker, who lives across the street from the school, recalled seeing a male figure enter the gym at about 8 o'clock, a half hour before the alleged time of the murder. "He was limping," she said. "Not much at all, but noticeable." Dwight Prescott limped on his right leg, an old sports injury. Ted Hamtree moved with military poise despite his age. But something still troubled Caldwell. For the third time, he looked at the forensic results of the photo album he had found. The experts had found clear fingerprints on the glossy surface of the photos. They belonged to Dwight Prescott. The detective opened his notebook, rereading the assistant coach's testimony. "I knew nothing about their relationship. Yes, she often stayed after practice, but I didn't follow her." Lies. All of his statements were lies. At dawn, the detective already knew how he'd get the killer out in the open. All he had to do was get the interrogation right. The interrogation room of the Oak Ridge police station was stuffy. The old fan under the ceiling was lazily blowing the stale air, creaking with exertion. Outside the window, a misty dawn was breaking. Caldwell hadn't slept in 24 hours, but he didn't feel tired. The nearness of the denouement was energizing. Rufus was used to the peculiar atmosphere of the last interrogations. For 30 years of work, he had learned to feel this moment, when the criminal already knew that he had been caught, but still clung to his lies. It's like the agony of a hunted animal. Dwight Prescott sat at his desk, tapping his fingers nervously on the metal surface. He was wearing the same shirt he'd worn on the day of the murder. He hadn't changed his clothes in the last 4 days, since the body had been found. The collar was soaked with sweat and there were coffee stains on the cuffs. Caldwell was deliberately silent, letting the silence do its work. He arranged the photographs on the table, slowly, one by one. Pictures from a scrapbook he had found. Mabel at practice, Mabel in the library, Mabel laughing with her head thrown back. Last, he put down the crime scene photo. "Let's go over it again from the beginning," the detective finally said, noting the way Dwight's fingers trembled. "You said you weren't following Miss Sterling, but your fingerprints are on every page of this scrapbook." "Yeah," Dwight licked his parched lips. "I can explain." "Of course you can. Like the incident in Nashville 3 years ago. The high school girl, Jane Porter. Did you take pictures of her too?" Dwight turned pale, drops of sweat appearing on his forehead. "It was a misunderstanding. All charges were dropped. Because the girl refused to testify, and Mr. Hamtree, your old coach, saved you by offering you a job here. Were you grateful to him?" Footsteps were heard in the hallway. The early shift was coming on duty. A door slammed somewhere. Dwight flinched at each sound. "Ted. He's always believed in me, ever since high school. I was a worthless player, but he said I had other talents. When I got into photography, he was the first to support me. Said I had a special vision. And then you saw him with Mabel." Dwight's fingers clenched into fists. Something dark, dangerous flashed in his eyes. He had no right. She was so much like Jane. The same movements, the same smile. I thought it would be different this time. I waited. I was patient. And he... Caldwell slowly opened the album. The pictures had been taken by a professional's hand. Precise angles, perfect composition. Obsession turned into art. "The first photo is dated March 3rd. You were already following her then, long before you knew about their relationship. Why Mabel?" "I loved her." Dwight's voice became muffled. "I really loved her, not like he did. To him, it was just an old man's whim. But I could make her happy. I knew it the first time I saw her on the field. She was special, not like all those empty-headed cheerleaders. She had an inner light." "Is that why you started taking pictures of her?" "At first it was just snapshots for the school paper. Then I started noticing details. The way she fixes her hair, the way she bites her lip when she's reading, the way she looks out the window during class. I wanted to preserve every moment." "And then you noticed her spending time with Tad." Dwight stood up, started pacing the room. His movements became abrupt, jerky. "I didn't realize it right away. I thought she was just consulting him like a father. He was like a father to a lot of people, after all. But then, I saw her face change around him, the way she blushed at the occasional touch, and the way he looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at his fiancée 40 years ago." "Is that why you stole the bat from Peterson's store?" "I wanted to talk to her, explain. The bat, it came out by accident. I was walking past the store, pissed off after practice. She was lingering in his office again. And then I saw this bat in the window. I thought it was a sign, the same bat that made him a legend." Dwight lowered his head. "Thought if she found out the truth about his past affairs with college girls..." "Affairs?" "I was looking for information, digging through old files. Thought I'd find something to defame him. But there was nothing. Not a single scandal in 45 years. Impeccable reputation. And then I saw them in the park. They were holding hands. He was stroking her hair." Dwight's voice trailed off. He collapsed into a chair, covering his face with his hands. "I waited for her in the locker room. I wanted to show her the pictures, tell her about Nashville, how it covered for me. I thought she'd realize he wasn't who he said he was. But she wasn't scared. No, she just laughed, said I was pathetic, that people like me belonged in prison, that she knew all about Jane, about my pictures, about my obsession with young girls. She was going to tell the principal of the school. And you hit her. I didn't mean to. I had the bat in my hand. I don't even remember how it happened. She fell, and then I saw blood. So much blood. And then you staged the crime scene to frame Ted Hamtree. He deserved it. A feverish gleam appeared in Dwight's eyes. He's always been impeccable, a great coach, a wise mentor. And me, I was just a shadow, a backup. All these years. Caldwell pulled the last photo out of the folder, a snapshot of the crime scene. You left too many traces. Photographs, prints, Paint from the display case on your clothes. A professional photographer should be more attentive to detail. You know what the funny thing is? Dwight laughed hysterically. I really thought I could protect her. From him, from everyone. I wanted to be her hero, and I became the very monster I wanted to protect her from. It was finally dawning outside the window. The morning light mercilessly highlighted the circles under Dwight's eyes, the wrinkles on his forehead, the gray in his hair. He looked about 10 years older. When the handcuffed policeman entered the office, he didn't resist, only asked quietly, "How did you know it was me?" "Photographs," Caldwell replied. "A real photographer can't resist composition. Even the crime scene you've organized as a perfect shot. The light, the shadows, the positioning of the body, all like an art photograph." Dwight was led away. Caldwell was left alone in the stuffy office. He gathered the photographs, folded them neatly into a folder. The final touch of the investigation was to be a conversation with Ted Hamptree. The old coach was waiting for him on the porch of his house. He knew the detective was coming. "Was that Dwight?" he asked without raising his eyes. "Yes, he confessed to everything." "I should have noticed, should have realized something was wrong with him." "You couldn't have known." "I could have, but I was too busy with myself. My feelings for Mabel, thinking only about whether it was right or wrong. I should have been thinking about other things." Ted pulled an envelope from his pocket. "It's a letter of resignation. It's final this time." "Where will you go?" "To California. My sister lives there. She says the ocean helps you forget." A week later, Dwight Prescott was brought to trial. He was sentenced to life in prison. Ted Hamptree left town before the trial was over, and Oak Ridge Cemetery had a new monument, white marble with a simple inscription, "Mabel Sterling. She loved life." Caldwell visited the grave before leaving. He placed on the marble the only photograph he had saved from the case, Mabel laughing with her head tilted toward the sun. That was how she was to be remembered. The city was gradually returning to normal life. News became stories, stories became legends, but something was forever changed in Oak Ridge. Something in the air itself, in the whisper of the leaves, in the reflections of the setting sun in the windows of the old school. And somewhere in the archives of the police station is a file on the murder of a cheerleader, a story of love, obsession, and betrayal written in blood on the pages of a small Tennessee town.